From busy cities to remote villages, digital media has revolutionized how Pakistan shares information. The more we understand this, the better off we'll be in digesting news, interacting with stories, and comprehending the world. This topic of digital media is very close to my heart as a podcaster and a publisher serving the Pakistani audience. However, I have an outsider's perspective on digital media in Pakistan. And for that reason, in this episode of the Misaal podcast, I'm thrilled to host someone who's way smarter than me on this topic. Her name is Muna Khan, and she's a columnist at Dawn and a journalism educator in some of the prominent universities in Pakistan. We discuss Pakistan's changing media landscape, opportunities, challenges, and what the future looks like for digital media in Pakistan. Let's listen in. Welcome to the Misaal podcast, Muna. How are you?
Well, thank you. So nice to be here.
We're really excited to have you on. I know this podcast is a long time in the making, and I really enjoy your columns on Dawn about media.
Thank you.
I know you have a lot of insights on the media, and I just was like, okay, I really am interested in media in Pakistan, so no better person to talk about it than you. And let's get started with a quick introduction. Please tell me a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I've been working as a journalist since 1995, largely in Pakistan. And I've spent some time in Vietnam. I've spent many stints in Dubai. I spent a short stint in London. I'm a graduate of the master's program at Northwestern University in 2017, and then I returned to Karachi to teach at the journalism program at CEJ. And since then, I've sort of been floating around a little bit. I've worked a little bit at Aj, and then I'm now sitting down and writing a weekly column as much as possible on the media. I do research the news media, and I'm happy to be here and happy to share whatever insights I have.
So let's just start with a basic introduction on the state of digital media in Pakistan. Like, what are the trends? What are the changes you have observed, good and bad, in recent years?
So I just want to specify that I'll be talking more about the digital news media and traditional media because that's something I'm most familiar with. There is such a boom in digital media as far as like whether we're looking at people doing podcasts or people doing their own shows on YouTube and stuff. And so I can't keep up with all of them naturally, but I do think, so I will be looking at some notes I took, so don't mind me moving around a little bit, folks. But I did read a really good report, which I thought would help sort of lay the land a little bit. And this was Pakistan's internet landscape from 2022. If we look at our population, which is 241 million, and I'll just set aside all the controversy around the census. I think that report is a really good one because it tells us like we've made some gains like in internet access, but we're still very far behind on so many metrics not just in the world, but even in Asia. So yes, more people have access to the internet. I don't know how meaningful it is, but when you look at the state of the economy, when you look at the state of the energy sector with load shedding, power cuts, the gender gaps in access, things are bad. Digital governance, just to remind you, every government has tried, and they're, again, very small gains. So yes, maybe Nadra is online, but Omar Saif is our current IT minister, and he's got very big ambitions for trying to digitize so many initiatives, but we've seen that with every government. In PTI, we had Tanya Idris come in. She was at Google. They also launched Digital Pakistan, but again, there were a lot of problems there. There were allegations of conflict of interest. There was in-party fighting. I think they had different expectations of her that she would bring foreign funding. I don't mean to veer off track, but I'm just trying to just lay a little bit of the land about what is the state, the finer points of digital. Now, they made some really valuable points. Like last year when we had terrible floods, it just destroyed our telecom sector. So just imagine how a very vulnerable group of people who needed comms could not even access any form of telecom. So just imagine where we are on a holds like where we are as a country. The part that really interested me was that 15% of people lack internet access or telecom access and mobile access. So when you look at it like that, vast communities that are not being represented in the news media. And that's what really interests me, which is what is the news media, both traditional and digital? Who are they reporting on and who are they not reporting on? And as a result of this, what kind of a picture do you get when you watch the news? I think another important thing that I think about is, and I think this is true for a lot of countries around the world, I want to be sure this is not just about Pakistan, is that what is journalism about right now? And I feel that journalism is about politics more than it is about journalism. And I look at journalism as reporting that is done in the public interest. And I think I don't feel good about many news outlets and what they're doing in Pakistan.
I would love to understand, how did the traditional media, or, media houses that were mostly like newspapers and stuff or TV channels, how are they adopting to the digital landscape? Are they being on the sidelines at this time and seeing what works and then they jump on? Or is this something that they're proactively pursuing?
In my teachings and some trainings I do, I always start the class or session with this discussion on who's a journalist. And it's probably the most lively discussion. And over the years, it's changed. So, in the olden days, maybe the discussion would be, a copy editor is not a journalist, or a columnist is not a journalist, or it would be about that. And over the years, it's now become like a social media. Are they a journalist? It's like, no. Are people who read the news on TV journalists? And of course, now primetime anchors, many of them will come from different fields. And we have a lot of doctors who are posing as journalists. It's a lively discussion. And I think I just wanted to bring that up, and I'll tie it back. Who is a journalist? It sort of tells us a little bit about the state of the media. Traditional media in this country, in all countries, I should say, it is facing challenges largely from social media. And traditional media, business houses, it's a reflection of their business model. Because they're working on for-profit models, their relationships with advertisers, with governments, with government agencies, just a reminder that Pakistan's media is reliant on government advertising. And think about it. What happens? The more critical you are of government, the less you'll get advertising. I think those are important things to remember. So your hands are really tied when it comes to who you're reporting on and who you're not reporting on. That space is now challenged by social media or digital media, where, again, on social media, you can say whatever you want and there are no consequences for it. You don't have to issue a retraction. You don't have to. It's big business now in Pakistan to have all these vloggers who are using YouTube as a space to peddle whatever they like. They're making thousands of rupees or dollars selling all kinds of stories. The traditional media is not able to do that because they're still accountable. They're still practicing rules of journalism, which are reporting, getting diverse opinions, trying to have some semblance of balance, fairness. I'm speaking in the basics just to, again, give a slight kind of overview. How is traditional media handling these challenges? I think they're sort of learning it on the job based on my experience and what I've seen elsewhere. They're attempting what they call a convergence model. So many of the legacy outlets have a television channel or some form of newspaper, and then they have websites. And they're sort of using their reporting on their traditional platforms and switching it around and pushing it onto their digital outlets. So digital outlets then are doing some original reporting, but the state of the news media from an economic point of view is terrible. Salaries are so low. There have been so many layoffs. Again, this goes back to the business model. If you're not generating enough revenue, you can't put it back into your business. So people are overworked, understaffed, and really, really underpaid. I want to tell you about somebody that I know who tweeted that they saw on a social media post that somebody was advertising for house help for maids, and they were saying that they're willing to pay, they're paying about $30,000 for an 8-hour job. And this person wrote saying that that's 5,000 rupees more than what they are earning in a digital news outlet. And it's truly heartbreaking. So I think that understanding the state of the newsroom will help your viewers understand why the news is disseminated in the way that it is. It's truly very, very unfair. And I think news managers who are working in traditional media outlets are not very familiar with the digital landscape. They're not familiar with the emerging audience that is digital natives, who in Pakistan are growing in number as far as demographics go. And with due respect, the people consuming television is decreasing. From an anecdotal level, I don't really know. You don't really hear of people who watch television. Most of television is consumed also in social media formats. If you go through Twitter, you'll see most primetime shows. You see that they're up in clips on Twitter, for example. So people will be consuming that in format. So Aurora Magazine from Dawn Group does a great year. Every year they do TV viewership trends. So the last one that they've done is from 2021 to 2022. And it shows a drop in viewership from 3.42 hours in 2021 to 2.95 in 2022. Now, of that viewership, I think it's important to say that 40% is in entertainment and 19% is in news. So when I started teaching, that figure for news consumption was 16%. And I think that increase of just 3% in all these years, I credit that to Imran Khan, who's really brought in a lot of eyeballs. So I hope in some way that's like kind of answered your question. Digital outlets of news organizations in the past few years have produced some outstanding work as far as reporting goes in the form of explainers and really putting things in context. But with staffing issues, with really like who wants to be a journalist? I struggle with this. I can't sell it. I can't sell it to my students anymore, given the kind of salaries being offered to starting positions. So I'm not surprised the state is where it is.
This is a good segue into my next question, which is about media literacy, right? Because if you talk to anyone on like digital media, they'll tell you like, oh, they have to produce certain kind of content because that's what people want, right? So do you feel like media literacy in Pakistan is like, do people understand what they're consuming might just be an opinion, or are they just like, overwhelmed and bombarded by information from everywhere that whatever is convenient, whatever is thrown at them is what sticks with them, and that's what they run with. And there's never any, like you said, no one comes and says we made a mistake, or if they do make a mistake, the headline itself, that's been shared everywhere. That just goes viral, even if it's a correction made later on. I've seen this in tech, also tech reporting, where even if a correction is made, no one talks about that because the headline was completely misleading, and that's what got a lot of attention.
Yes. So I think that to remind, the corrections will always be made by news media organizations because they are much more responsible, and mistakes are made because of human error. But when it comes to media literacy, I think that I always hear from my students and just randomly people that I meet that, this is not journalism. Ye journalism nahi hai, ye galat hai. And when asked what is journalism, inevitably it is them seeking opinions that suit them and suit their perspectives. So media literacy is very important. But I actually don't know what fighting disinformation looks like, because this report that I quoted, The Internet Landscape, it talks about it, that I wanted to quote from it about how the online environment is so dangerous with threat of blasphemy allegations, online campaigning, mob organizing, and subsequent violence, including lynching. This is a very, very dangerous environment, and we've seen it. And I wanted to focus on blasphemy because it is an issue that it has plagued Pakistan, but especially right now with the attacks on Ahmadi mosques, especially, it's really problematic. But how do you fight this? And I think it's also an opportunity for more collaborative work amongst software engineers, civil society activists, lawyers, journalists to come together, because I think leaving it in the hands of big tech to solve this problem is not going to be useful. A lot of the problems have been caused by big tech and their algorithm. You now have AI, which is a player in this field. I don't know the answers. I've looked at everyone around the world is figuring it out. And anytime I see something, whether it's in Europe, I do see that it seems to be collaborative. And I wonder if folks in your community would have some answers. Because young people, children, we've seen this all our lives, right? That we know how to navigate technology that our parents can't manage. I think it's important to start media literacy from a very young age, just like we start all subjects and they progress with more information. I think it needs to start. So for example, I'm teaching a media literacy course at an arts college in Karachi, which I've not done before. And we just did a fact-checking exercise yesterday. And it was very useful. So we took 1 hour to examine the reporting on the death of a PTI leader's son. It was a tragic death, but we spent 1 hour going through headlines and information. And they were exhausted by the end of it and frustrated because they were seeing themselves the kind of information, the kind of lies peddling as information from all sides. I don't want to blame one or the other, but I found it to be very instrumental that they were like, wow, this is really hard. So I was like, okay, let's stop with the journalism is rubbish, because look at the challenges in which we have to produce this information. So yes, media literacy is important, but it has to come from many, many different angles.
Yeah, you mentioned what just like the software developers and all these other people who can come up with solutions. So in your point of view, we touched a little bit on the business model of traditional media, for example, is a lot of government advertisement and all that stuff. So because of that, there is a certain bias that will always be there, or certain incentives to not report on certain things, right? So what do you feel, or are there any examples you can share in maybe outside of Pakistan? What do you think entrepreneurs and investors should be focusing on if they, for example, want to solve any problems within the media landscape? Because as far as I know, there is no media tech startup in Pakistan that is solving that issue. The one startup that raised some money back in the day was MangoBuzz. It's still around. They talk about pop culture, so it's not really I wouldn't say that's something that's people that can change people's minds, because they are also once again feeding people what they want, which is pop culture stuff, entertainment and stuff. But other than that, there have been no investments into any sort of media organization. So where do you feel there could be, something that could be done? Are there any examples you can share?
I loved MangoBuzz, and one of its co-founders, Ali Essen, has come to my class 2 times in 2017 and 18 to give lectures to students. And I want to bring it back now. What I liked about him, he was like, we're not journalists. But I think they were doing a lot of the work that journalists should have been doing. When we talk about that they were doing pop culture and listicles, or maybe a BuzzFeed-like model, I think they were serving their audience's needs. And oftentimes they were taking up stories about, one that I remember was they took up a story of some form of sexual abuse by a cleric at the time that news agencies did not do. And that story really resonated with a lot of people. So I know that they did not see themselves as journalists, but what are journalists doing? Who is a journalist? We'll always find a way in some conversation to bring it back to that. So I do think they practiced good journalism because they addressed stories that concerned their audience. And it was very popular. They talked to students. They had a vertical on, I'm forgetting the name, but something like campus, something like that. And they picked up on issues at LUMS and IVA, and they talked about this. And sure, they used humor, but let me remind you of how back in the early 2020s or late 20 teens that there was a Pew survey that said most Americans trusted Jon Stewart and John Oliver for their news sources because those guys were covering stories that others weren't. And I think they resonate with younger audiences. So I want to bring that back. They may not identify as journalists, but I think they're doing the work of journalism, which is reporting in the public interest. And then we can talk about who's public, et cetera, but the basic goal is there. I know that the current.pk received a Google News Initiative funding. I haven't seen what they've done with it. I'm not familiar with how, but they're a little bit more regular in their reporting. You may remember the Current for its kind of videos following politicians and journalists around, sort of like a 73 questions that Vogue used to do, something similar concept. And they had a host of people from artists to actors to also politicians and journalists. They now are a lot more regular with their updating their website. And again, they're a good example because they are they've understood their audience and they're appealing to them. Another example I have, which is doing very good work, which is a new media outlet, is Lok Sujag. Lok Sujag does fantastic reporting on communities that are marginalized and whose stories do not make it to mainstream media. And they are a news organization. They're hosting conversations in the form of podcasts also with young people. So they've had conversations on issues that matter to younger communities, whether they are issues of sexual identity, political identity, climate change. I bring up these three topics because in the last few years of my teaching, I am finding students disengaged with politics, as you and I may refer to it, and I like to call it Bajwa Faiz Imran, that kind of obsession. And they're just disenchanted with that. Instead, they're really concerned about their future. And that future ties into issues like climate change, issues like their own personal safety, and who they are and where they stand in this vast landscape in Pakistan today.
One question I wanted to ask you is, how Washington Post or New York Times, like they have a, subscription, people pay for it. This is one thing that I have discussed this with a lot of people who, questioned me as to why, I am not trying out different things, different models, because, I have time and I can experiment with certain things. And one thing that I always tell them is like, no one is going to pay for news in Pakistan. Like, it's just not possible to make people pay for news in Pakistan because for the past 50 years, they have received it for free, right? So it just doesn't happen like, they'll be like paying for news. But what I do believe can happen is a more like an NPR type model, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but NPR is member funded. So that's something I still believe that's possible in Pakistan. And the Lok Sujag or the Current, all these media organization, it seems like they do prop up, but eventually they die out. That's because there's not a stable or sustainable funding model that keeps them going. So where do you see that entrepreneurs can come in and try and experiment and do certain things to see if the market is going to bite? Like they'll be like, okay, fine, we will pay for this thing, but we won't pay for that thing or something along those lines.
I'm happy to hear you say that you think that people, yes, people won't pay for news because they've gotten it for free. That's something journalists made a mistake when the internet came and they just put it out there for free. Yeah. Wall Street Journal knew and the Financial Times knew that but these are niche publications. The New York Times also has gone back and forth on it. Remember, they did various forms of paywalls, 20 for free. But the New York Times, actually, Donald Trump was a bad thing that happened to them because they got such a big boost and they're doing very well from a digital subscription point of view. and they're cooking and they've done great work. The Washington Post too, but I think they're sort of struggling. Number one, I think public models of journalism are really important. And again, I don't know how to work on that. So all I can do is advocate for it in the hope that more heads can come together and look at ways to work on that, whether that's important. Number two, I do think profit is a wonderful example of a subscription-based model that is working. Now, I'm saying working, meaning I don't know how well they're doing financially. By working, I mean that they have shown that people will pay for news. Profit is, one of the founders is Babar Nizami, and I had the good fortune to have a conversation with him, and we talked about how independent journalism is possible. They're showing it. People are paying. That independence journalism allows Profit Magazine to report as they wish because they're not bound by advertisers. And they have done really good reporting. They've done exposés on, let's say, the ARY group, or they have reported on businesses that are doing good work, bad work. I have subscribed to them. They offered, when they started their subscription model, they offered an incentive, which was a digital subscription to Wall Street Journal as part of their package. It was affordable as well. And I think they have really shown, which is why I believe news organizations can take the risks and try paywalls, membership models. There are many examples to choose from. And I think that the one thing that I felt hopeful about from that internet landscape report was that let me double check. After all this fact checking, 51% rise in internet banking transactions in the year that they did it. And that's a really good number. So I think that because people are now more familiar with online payment, I think they'll be willing. I think news organizations may be scared because kya hoga, will people pay? But I think they need to do risk assessment, whatever is required to do that. But I'm confident that people will be ready to pay. Not trying these innovative business approaches. The world is full of examples, European models. Is it De Correspondent in Holland did a crowdfunding venture and raised a lot of money. I think it was then studied also at NYU, and efforts were made to try to recreate something like that. There are so many examples where people are willing to try, but not trying has resulted in, for example, the death of Newsline magazine and Herald magazine. These are two fixtures in our lives that did independent journalism and reported on so many important stories that had far-reaching consequences. And they were advocates for marginalized communities. They did very, very important work, which is part of our archives, but they could not survive. And that's such a tragedy because I believe there may have been ways to keep them going. I'm not saying I have the answers. I'm terrible at math, and I think most journalists are, which is why I become journalists. But I do think there are avenues to explore membership models, subscriptions, pay, all of that. And I thank the Prophet for showing us that way.
How about podcasts? Do you see podcasts, because podcasts have taken over in the past, I would say, a couple of years. And given that it's quite easy, I would say, to have a studio, and I'm pretty sure there are a lot of studios in Pakistan now that have space to do the podcast and stuff, makes it very easy for people to have one-on-one conversations with people who you will never see on mainstream media, right? So that in itself is like a good development. But then again, there are also very controversial people doing podcasts also. So once again, we find ourselves there is a great adoption of new media, which would be podcasting. But then again, there are certain players in there that are in it for the wrong reasons. So how do you feel like what's happened within the podcasting space within Pakistan?
I think it's a wonderful, wonderful boom, and also a indictment of sorts on what the news media is not doing. Why are people hosting these conversations? Of course, there is a monetization aspect, no doubt, because they've understood their demographic and their audience. But largely, people are here in this space because they can't find themselves in traditional media or their digital outlet. All of the stuff happening in the digital media is amazing. Yes, it's always going to have drawbacks, but we have to support freedom of speech and people's ability to say what they want, because censorship in Pakistan is just terrible. People are going on to their own platforms because A, they don't find themselves in traditional media landscape, or they are unable to say what they want to say on traditional media landscapes. So that's wonderful for marginalized groups, people who don't have the ability to say what they want. So we're having great conversations and hearing great conversations about a host of issues. And then, of course, people will step in and peddle information, blah, blah, blah. They're making a lot of money, but there should be space for everyone. So I think it's wonderful, but it's also, like I said, it tells us that traditional media outlets have not understood what's happening in digital. They could also use this opportunity to host their information, much like you see, like the Daily at New York Times or The Guardian with Today in Focus or The Economist. So many media outlets have their own audio podcasts. They're all the platforms. They're covering stories. And I haven't seen that yet in Pakistan. I'm trying to do a audio podcast myself, and I'm hoping that one of the media outlets, the traditional media outlets, will be game to try this. And I'm talking to them about it in the hope that, look, I can go on to YouTube, and I've done that. Me and my young journalist Tuba, we did a news media landscape podcast talking about the challenges in the news media. But I want to admit it's my laziness, which is why I couldn't really carry on with that, because I was just lazy about it. Now I'm attempting something new, which is archiving, a little bit more archival work by talking to journalists who have reported in so many years under very difficult circumstances with Zia, under Zia's rule. And I'm trying to do audio conversations with them, sort of like archival, because we don't archive, we just don't archive. Like, if you want to go read old Herald issues to see the stories that I'm talking about, I can't send you anywhere. It's not available online. So this is my small attempt to try to get people to share their remarkable, remarkable stories. I've done one interview with Ghazi Saab, so I'm happy to do that. But I want to do something with a news media organization. It is risky. Maybe nobody will listen to it because we haven't yet got onto audio and need a video component with it. But also, how do we know until we try? I think our jobs as journalists is also to teach audiences and get them into new places to try new things.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the audio thing, and it makes me smile because the audio and the video thing was the reason it took me such a long time to jump on this podcasting, because for audio, I was like, okay, sure, I can record the conversations, audio, nothing, it's not a big deal. But with video, I was a little conscious, and it took me a while before I got on to got comfortable with it.
Of course, it's so scary.
And there used to be a podcast. It was by Caravan. That's the name of the firm that used to. It was a VC firm. I don't know if they're still around, but there was a partner there. He was hosting conversations very similar to what I'm doing right now, which is with founders and investors. It was audio only, and it died down by 2020, and it died down. For me, it was okay, I know in Pakistan, if a podcast needs to work, it has to have a video component to it.
Right.
Otherwise, it's just not going to fly.
So I have some good news for you, which is that Tuba and Sabah, two journalists, they did a purely audio podcast, a true crime podcast investigating Mustafa Zaid's death, the poet. And they've done 2 seasons and it's done well. You know, unko bhi sab kehte the nahi karo, koi nahi sunega. But people have responded to it. And it's now come to a point where there is interest in, I think, a documentary or even maybe movies. I understand the mat karo. I understand that. But also I want to say there's hope. So their podcast is an example. Babar Nizami with Prophet is an example. There's also, you know, it's just a little bit of coming outside our comfort zone. And that's the risk. And I think it's worth taking if we're okay to say that, you know, I tried it and it didn't work and okay, it didn't work. You didn't hurt anybody, but you tried and you'll be remembered. So like an example, when I joined Aj in June 2021 or two, wait, COVID has screwed up my timeline. No, in 2021, I did 3 Twitter spaces when I first joined. And Uswat, everybody was like so mad at me and being like, nobody's going to listen. Twitter space, koi nahi sunega, kuch nahi hoga, kya? I had a lot of opposition. So I chose cricket as a subject. I worked with my former student, Brashna, who's an avid cricket enthusiast and writer and very good. And we hosted 3 Twitter spaces and it did really well. And then I think about a few months into it, individuals were hosting Twitter spaces, but I like to use that as an example of being a first mover. Sometimes, you know, I didn't pursue it thereon, but sometimes being a first mover can be a very insightful learning experience. After that, we tried Facebook Live discussions focusing on issues impacting KP because we had a wonderful bureau chief, Farzana Ali, out in Peshawar. So she hosted them with a few people. And so creating niche audiences. I think, yes, I think it worked. Somebody else doesn't think it worked. And so metrics play a big role. I understand. So you look at metrics, then you create something else. But I think trying new things is important and also shows that you understand audiences' informational needs. And right now, we're in this kind of a very strange race just to, you know, have constant breaking news. I don't want to downplay that. I understand the role of that because that will get us the eyeballs, which will get us the advertising, which will allow business to continue. I understand that. But I also think we have to do some innovation on our own. And I believe younger journalists have a very good understanding of their community needs. And I think I would love to see them have more of a say at the table making those decisions. And unfortunately, I feel at the moment, people making those decisions do not understand the digital landscape.
You kind of answered my last question that I had for you, which is like the predictions about like the future, and you kind of, touched on that. So, I mean, do you expect, so for me, it's like, okay, podcasting is of course here to stay. And of course there's YouTube and stuff. Do you feel like one day there might be just a news organization just based on YouTube? Like they're just running everything from YouTube. They have podcasts and they have a blog and that's pretty much it. They don't have a studio or anything, but they can do everything on YouTube.
Why not? I don't have a definitive answer on that, but I don't see why not. I hope to see, I think the opportunities coming up, of course, we have an economic crisis. So I know people who are trying to start new news sort of journalism-based ventures, but aren't able to receive funding because things are not looking very good. But I think in the long term, let's say 5 to 10 years, I'm hopeful about new ventures coming out and with a far more nuanced understanding of serving audience needs. I'm hopeful that news organizations themselves will find ways to address those challenges that they're facing right now from a business point of view. I think I touched on it a little, but I think the largest challenge for everyone in Pakistan is censorship and how to really fight censorship and I think with so many fractured unions, press unions across Pakistan with so many vested interests. I think it's going to be a challenge, but I really would love to see people coming together across news organizations and putting their heads together and coming up with ways to challenge, for example, the sedition laws that are so easy to just crack. It's just like little sprinkle, nahi aapne ye keh diya, aap anti-Pakistan hai, anti-state hai, anti-religion hai. Those are real threats. And I would love to see, I don't have the answer for it, but I would love to participate in an initiative. Bologid is an advocacy group, the Digital Rights Foundation. They do such remarkable work fighting disinformation, challenging these laws. But what would it look like if so many more groups came together? Because ultimately, these laws impact everyone. But the fissures in society, the polarization is so strong that it's hard for us to get out of our blinkers because we're so happy right now and watching PTI ke saath jo ho raha hai. Wohi jab PTI वापस आएगी अगर आए. It's just a cycle that's not ending. So I would love to see those kind of collaborative efforts because these laws, censorship, it impacts every single one. It's just a matter of when it comes for you. So I would love to see that. I don't know what that would look like, but that's what I would like to see because ultimately audiences are being impacted and journalism just becomes more and more politicized and veers further away from journalism.
Thank you so much. This has been one of the most insightful conversations I've had.
Really?
I'm a lot more informed now about media than I was before starting this conversation.
I'm glad.
So thank you so much. Thank you for being on the Misaal podcast.
No, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for asking these questions. And I really hope that people listening in feel free to write to me if you want more answers. This is stuff I really care about. I and a whole group of journalists are really, really impacted by this. And we want free speech, even when it's cuckoo stuff. We want people the ability, and I have a lot of faith in news-consuming audiences that ultimately they will figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, the narrative is very important. And I think the stories we tell ourselves is what, that's how you create a future. And I think the future, if it has to be a good future, then the stories we tell have to, of course, change. And that's what builds on a good narrative. And I will, of course, leave all your information in the description and stuff.
Yeah, write to me if you like.
People can reach out to you. And thank you so much again.
Thank you, Zahid. This was so good. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Misaal podcast. I hope you enjoyed the podcast and will thank me by writing a review or sharing it on social media. Make sure you follow and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Thanks again. See you soon.